Hi, I'm Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing. I'm sorry I couldn't join you this week in Tirana for the conference on redefining the roles of private and public sectors with respect to housing. I think your conversation is really timely. I think we desperately need to reclaim the public nature of housing and housing as a social good. As many of you will know, my last report to the UN Human Rights Council focused on financialization, which really is an important part of this conversation. In recent years, the housing sector has been transformed by global financial actors and unprecedented amounts of excess capital. It's no longer as we once knew it. Housing has been financialized. It's now valued as a commodity rather than a human dwelling. It is now a means to secure and accumulate wealth rather than a place to live in dignity and raise a family and thrive within community. It has become security for financial instruments traded and sold on global markets. And I fear it has lost its currency as a universal human right. Is this phenomenon new? Is the financialization of housing new? I'm often asked, and I would answer that what's new is the pace and extent to which financial corporations and funds are taking over housing and real estate. It's simply quite staggering. Global residential real estate is now valued at 163 trillion US dollars. That's more than twice the entire world's total GDP. Banks, pension and hedge funds, private equity firms, and other kinds of financial intermediaries seek out funding now in hedge cities as a safe haven to park excess capital. They often benefit from tax shelters and use a lack of transparency to provide cover for anonymous investors and capital gained through corruption. This has resulted in gross inequality, whereby huge segments of the urban population are being removed and left out. They're being evicted from their homes, they're being excluded from planning processes and development of new housing, they're being rendered homeless, living in the harshest of conditions, or they're forced to live in grossly inadequate informal settlements, lacking security of tenure and subject to a host of other human rights violations. This influx in capital has created unaffordable housing markets. Housing in most cities, the cost of housing in most cities has increased to levels that most residents cannot afford. If you look at London, for example, or Stockholm, since the global financial crisis and even in more recent years, those cities have seen increases in housing by up to 50%. In Stockholm in 2015 alone, housing increased by 15%. Housing prices are no longer commensurate with household income levels and instead are driven by the demand for housing assets among investors, including global investors. And when housing prices skyrocket, low and sometimes even middle-income residents are forced out of their communities by high rent or mortgage costs. When housing prices plummet, residents face mortgage foreclosure and homelessness, as we saw after the global financial crisis. In Spain, for example, in the 5 years after the financial crisis, more than 500,000 foreclosures resulted in 300,000 households being evicted. Evictions of this scale, one might think, would give rise to international outrage about violations of the right to housing, but that's not what we saw. In fact, we saw that the main actors involved really escaped any human rights accountability. State responses have always favored the interests of financial institutions over the needs of those who have lost their homes. The human rights implications of financialization I detailed in my report, and I came up with 3 central ones, which I'll provide to you now. They may not be the only human rights obligations, but they're the central ones that I've identified. Financialization undermines democratic governance and community accountability. International financial institutions and other creditors often require that states be held accountable to global finance rather than to human rights. I certainly witnessed this in my mission to Portugal. Governments are more likely to respond to what credit agencies demand than to what human rights require. In financialized housing markets, those making decisions about housing, its use, its cost, where it will be built, or whether it will be demolished, often do so from remote boardrooms. Real estate billionaires increasingly assume central roles in government and policy making. The financialization of housing also exacerbates inequality and social exclusion. It creates more wealth for those who are already wealthy, and it deprives the poor of housing and communities. It encourages gentrification and displaces the most marginalized, including Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, women, and migrants. And financialization detaches housing from its connection to communities and to the human dignity and security that are at the core of all human rights. When housing is bought and sold as a speculative commodity, it becomes dehumanized. The needs of existing residents, or the kinds of housing they need, is of little concern to global financial actors or investors. When housing is bought by a nameless corporation, or a multi-billion-dollar fund, it's difficult to know who to hold accountable, and it's difficult to hold anyone accountable. But of course, we know that states are accountable. States are accountable because of and through their human rights obligations. I'm always reading in the newspaper that the cause of housing bubbles or overheated housing markets is a result of a lack of supply and too much demand. But what I never read is that, in fact, the cause of housing bubbles or overheated housing markets is really the failure of states to regulate real estate markets in a manner that is consistent with their human rights obligations. But I want to make it clear that real estate markets don't exist on their own. They are the creation of states, and they are the product of laws and regulations governing land and property rights. This is important because states, the creators of those markets, also have human rights obligations. And those obligations should have a bearing on how they create and interact with markets. What I'm suggesting here is not the dismantling of capitalism. I'm often asked if that's what I'm on about, and it's not. But I'm also not suggesting a business and human rights approach, which tends to focus on the direct human rights obligations that businesses have. Instead, what I'm concerned with is the obligations that states must impose on businesses under domestic law in order for the state to comply with its international human rights obligations. The point that I emphasized in my report on financialization and housing is that the obligations of businesses and investors in relation to housing are to be determined, regulated, and enforced by states. If states heavily rely on private markets to meet their obligation to fulfill the right to housing, and most do, then they must regulate private investment in housing consistently with that obligation. That means stopping private actors from violating human rights, for example, by evicting people, especially evicting people into homelessness. But it means much more than that. It means states must redesign the laws and regulations that define real estate markets so that instead of developing housing for the rich only, housing is redefined as a human right, a social good, fundamental to inclusive, vibrant, diverse communities. Earlier this year, a UN committee responsible for interpreting states' social and economic human rights obligations released a legal interpretation on this very issue. Referred to as General Comment Number 24, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights referenced my report to clarify that states would violate their duty to protect human rights if they failed to regulate the real estate market and the financial actors operating on this market so as to ensure access to affordable and adequate housing for all. Okay, as it stands, we are a far cry away from that reality. We don't have too many states regulating real estate markets in a manner that is consistent with their human rights obligations. And we know that governments are more likely to respond to what credit agencies demand of them than to what human rights require, as I said before. But I believe that getting there shouldn't be impossible. We have in international human rights law the right to adequate housing, to life, to security, and to dignity. We have those as existing rights. We now have, thanks to the committee and my own report, I suppose, the clarity of state obligations under this law to redesign housing markets and regulate housing investment consistently with international human rights law and the right to adequate housing. And now we have commitments made by all states to realize and secure adequate and affordable housing by 2030 in the Sustainable Development Goals. And lastly, I would add, I believe we have a growing movement of people from all sectors in cities around the world affirming with an increasingly unified voice that it's time to act. And I think the pressures on Airbnb imposed by cities and imposed by other actors are an example of that, as are new taxes to try to curb overheated housing markets is a sign in which citizens and everyday people are complaining and governments are complaining too and responding. This new sense of urgency around housing as one of the major crises throughout the world affecting so many millions and millions of people. It's for this reason that I have initiated, in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the organization called United Cities Local Government, which represents over 250,000 municipalities, a new initiative called The Shift. The Shift is a worldwide, multi-sectoral movement to reclaim and realize the human right to housing. It will change how the world thinks about and interacts with housing and home. Each of us, in my opinion, must become a shifter if we believe in humanity and human rights. If you want more information about the shift, by all means contact me, and do look for updates through networks like Fianza and the European Housing Research Network. I wish you the best of luck in your deliberations, and I look forward to working with you well into the future. Thank you.